Good evening again. My name is Berit Ebert. I'm the Vice President of Programs here at the Academy. And I welcome you to the Andrew W. Mellon Lecture, Colonialism, Propaganda and Postcolonial Legacies with Dominic Thomas. Dear Dominic, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're eagerly looking forward to your talk. Before we listen to you, I would like to say a little bit about the context of today's lecture, which takes place as part of a week-long workshop in the humanities, a program that we inaugurated in the fall of 2018 with the generous support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We have since been able to bring 2 fellows per year to the Academy, and after each semester, the respective fellow organizes a workshop to further intellectual debate about 3 designated themes. And these are migration and integration, race and comparative perspective, as well as exile and return. This week's workshop, Immobilities, New Directions in the Humanities, is chaired by Leila Amine and Hakim Abderrazak, whose fellowships took place during the COVID lockdowns in the fall of 2020 and in the spring of 2021. So they had to leave Berlin with a little bit of unfinished business. However, it has been worth the wait and the pain and probably the stalking on our part with you, Hakim and Leila. And almost a year and a half later, Leila and Hakim have returned to us and brought with them a group of outstanding scholars from the US, from France, Ireland, and Austria. And these are Patrick Crowley from the University College Cork, Fatima El-Tahib from Yale University, Sandra Fouli at the University of Vienna, Brenda Mita from Mills College, Michelle Murray from Vanderbilt University, Valerie Orlando from the University of Maryland at College Park, and Dominic Thomas from the University of California at Los Angeles. The good news for all of you who are here tonight is some of them, or most of them, are among the audience. So when we will have our reception at the terrace later, we also booked sunshine today. You will have the opportunity to talk to them and further engage with them about what they discovered here during their week with us. And now let's give a warm welcome to the group. This is you now. Thank you. That works. And as one of the workshop chairs, Hakim will be in discussion with Dominic following his presentation today. So I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Hakim, who will later introduce Dominic. Hakim is an associate professor of French and Francophone studies at the University of Minnesota. There, he belongs to the affiliated faculty in a doctoral program in comparative studies in discourse and society, the Department of Asian Languages and Literatures, the interdepartmental graduate minor in moving image studies, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, and the program in Religious Studies. Before Hakim apparently decided to take every possible job that is available in the university, he completed his PhD in French Studies at Northwestern University, and he is the author of Eccentric Migrations, Europe and the Maghreb in Mediterranean Cinema, Literature and Music, which, along with the major part of his other publications, tackles the questions and the representations of unauthorized sea crossings in literary artistic works that have appeared in Arabic, Berber, French, Italian, and Spanish. Before I turn the mic over to Hakim, who will introduce Dominic, I'd like to mention that in the second part of this evening, you are most welcome to ask questions as well. Be tough. Challenge the speakers, they're here for that. And the same is true for the Zoom audience. You can ask your questions in the Q&A bottom feature at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Hakim, the floor is yours, and thank you again.
Thank you, Berit, for this very generous introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. Oh, yes, without the mask would be better. I'm sorry. Sometimes you forget that you're wearing a mask. So yes, thank you to everyone, to all of you for being here tonight. And I would also like to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation, whose funds have made this event possible. I would also like to thank the American Academy, as well as Barrett and Johanna, who have done a lot of work organizing this event since 2020. So putting the work every year until this has been made possible. And I also thank everyone who worked behind the scenes. As Barrett has mentioned, tonight's lecture is the public-facing event component of the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship workshop, whose theme is Immobilities, New Directions in the Humanities. And I'd like to thank the participants to the workshop who have given excellent papers and who have shared their ongoing projects, who will likely contribute to shaping new directions in the humanities. It is my honor, and it's not just a formula, it is really an honor to present, to introduce Professor Dominic Thomas, whose work I've known since graduate school, and whose work we all knew from the very beginning of our studies, because he is a major figure in many, many fields. You could not do graduate studies in my field or related fields without having read and benefited a great deal from his scholarship. So I'm going to read a bio that does not do justice to him, because it's a real bio will take the whole time of the that we have today, but this short version should give you an idea of the impressive nature of his scholarship. So Dominic Thomas holds the Maitland Letossier Chair in French at the University of California, Los Angeles, and served as head of department for 13 years, establishing the new Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies in 2021. He was also the director of UCLA Global Learning Institute Paris Global Studies Program and director of the Center for the Study of Global France for 16 years. He is associate member of the Center of International History and Political Studies of Globalization at the University of Lausanne, the recipient of a Fulbright Commission Summer Award to Germany, was recently appointed to the Global Diplomacy Lab, and is an elected member of the Academy of Europe and an elected fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He has held fellowships, residencies, and visiting professorships in Australia, France, Germany, Mali, South Korea, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and provides expert evaluations to international learned or professional societies, notably the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, Prince Claus Fund, European Science Foundation, Swiss National Science Foundation, FWF Austrian Science Fund, Agence Nationale de la Recherche, and the National Science Foundation. Professor Thomas' research has had a profound interdisciplinary impact on multiple fields, including literary studies and African and European studies, and research areas such as globalization, censorship, propaganda, immigration, identity, museology, racism, human rights, and environmental studies. He is a global, transnational scholar who is invited to speak at events around the world, festivals, guest lectures, government bodies, international relations advisory meetings. He regularly contributes op-eds and is a media personality who has provided expert analysis as CNN's European Affairs commentator since 2016. He is author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of over 30 works. Well, including most recently colonial culture in France since the Revolution that came out in 2014, the invention of race that came out the same year, Vers la guerre des identités that appeared in 2016, The Colonial Legacy in France 2017, Sexe, race et colonie 2018, Sexualité, identité et corps colonisés 2019, Visualizing Empire 2021, and Colonisation et Propagande 2022. He edits the Global African Voices series at Indiana University Press that focuses on translations of African literature into English and has translated works by Aimé Césaire, Sonny Laboutancy, Alain Mambancou, Emmanuel Dongala, and Abdurrahman Waberi. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dominic Thomas.
Thank you so much, Hakeem, for, you have your mask, yeah, your extremely generous and extensive biographical presentation. I just want to also begin by just thanking all of you for being here and everybody who's out there on Zoom who couldn't make it, and it's so wonderful to be able to speak in person to people and to be here. And I want to thank various members of the Academy as well, Daniel Benjamin, the President, Dr. Berit Ebert, thank you also for the introduction, Vice President of Programs, Joanna Gallup is somewhere here who's been absolutely incredible, the Senior Coordinator of Programs, and all the staff that work here that just make it just such an incredible place to be with friends and colleagues and to be thinking, and especially then to Professor Hakeem Abderrazak and Professor Leila Amin from the University of Wisconsin and Minnesota, who organized this incredible seminar on immobilities and sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. It's an incredible honor to be giving this lecture, especially since I've been here all week working with dear colleagues whose work is absolutely incredible. And I had the opportunity, because of this new book, which I'm happy to circulate if everyone is COVID okay with that, something to look at while I'm speaking away. So it's really a great opportunity to do that. And I'll talk a little bit more about the book and the co-authors as we get going. I've got some PowerPoints to share. I'm going to discuss some images specifically, but others will just sort of be up there as I speak, and we'll be very happy to talk about them later on. So thank you to all of you. Propaganda relies on narratives, and the images, texts, and broadcasts that provide the scaffolding upon which they are built are never neutral. They operate according to prescribed codes and signifiers, all of which aim to convince, inspire, mobilize, and seduce. Above all, they must be effective. They are also the product of their time, and they reveal a wealth of information on a given era, making it possible for us to assess how individuals and societies have been influenced by these imaginaries and complex myths. Propaganda and censorship are also inextricably linked. Walls, whether imaginary and concrete, continue to define 21st century life. But today we also speak of firewalls. The internet, social media, and pioneering developments in the domain of digital technologies have taken an age-old apparatus and amplified it, enabling information wars to run alongside physical ones. Access to information streams is often curtailed or, as we have recently seen in China, used to control the coverage of pandemic lockdown conditions. These mechanisms have also been accompanied by new forms of surveillance, legislative and technological measures designed to regulate, limit, and restrict access to information and content, control and monitor downloads and file sharing, while also introducing new forms of activism through leaks and anonymous postings. Disinformation campaigns influence every facet of contemporary life, and these new infodemics furnish us with a new grammar with which to explain society. Artists and intellectuals and transatlantic organizations such as the one that we are in today, along with some political leaders, are struggling to defend democratic institutions and principles, confronted with illiberal populists determined to restrict media freedom and weaken constitutional and juridical standards. Recourse to censorship and propaganda mechanisms is widespread, highlighting paranoia and projection, as recently confirmed in a statement by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and I quote, "If you want to know what Russia is planning, look at what Russia is accusing others of planning," end quote. As we think about the mechanisms that shaped imperial ambitions and assess the various post-colonial legacies, a range of power dynamics remain in place, evident in asymmetrical relationships and anchored in mindsets that are the product of conditioning and myths. These need to be demystified, deconstructed, dismantled, and ultimately decolonized, precisely because they interconnect with debates on police violence, environmental and social justice, and structural and systemic racism. The study of propaganda is especially helpful in this regard. Though my focus today is primarily on France, analogous observations and conclusions would be pertinent to many other former colonial powers, most notably the city of Berlin, where in 1884-1885 Chancellor Bismarck had convened the Berlin Congress. But Berlin also offers an overabundance of monuments and landmarks. Karl Hagenbeck, one of the main organizers of animal and human exhibitions, or zoos as they are often referred to, beginning in the 1870s, wanted to establish a permanent exhibition in Berlin's Wedding district. Although the project to display Germany's African colonies did not come to fruition, an elaborate program of street naming did take place in the area, and the Afrikanisches Viertel, the African Quarter, commemorates German colonies, explorers and conquerors, thereby transforming the landscape of the colonial metropolis. Various initiatives have been launched aimed at revisiting German colonial history. More recently, Berlin's Humboldt Forum has been front and center of public debates, an institution that finds itself at a historic crossroad, faced with the challenge of reconciling museological practices with historical reckoning, including the symbolic presence of a 52-foot sailboat from the South Pacific island of Luf from the Bismarck archipelago, acquired in 1903, that is now housed there. These examples share points of commonality with debates in France, a nation that in 2001 recognized slavery and the slave trade as crimes against humanity, but has struggled to deal in meaningful ways with its colonial history and therefore with the legacy of that history in contemporary society. To put things otherwise, how does a nation that enslaved, colonized, and collaborated reconcile these historic facts with the founding Republican ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity? Former French President Jacques Chirac attempted to build a 21st century globalized museum, the Quai Branly Museum, that has the holdings of Oceania, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, that have now been renamed after him in a long-standing French tradition, like some countries name airports after former leaders. In his inaugural address at the museum's opening in 2006, President Chirac highlighted how France wished to pay homage to peoples to whom, throughout the ages, history has all too often done violence. Peoples injured and exterminated by the greed and brutality of conquerors. Peoples humiliated and scorned, denied even their own history. Here I have a picture of Jacques Chirac in French Guyana in 1975, speaking and claiming that I am proud of the French colonial oeuvre. Critics were quick to draw attention to the contradictions in Chirac's characterization of history, while of course simultaneously showing how his rhetoric was at odds with his policies on immigration and ethnic minorities, and the radical nature of his relativism is especially troubling, given that in this history of violence and exploitative brutality, France's role remains unclear, especially the impact and role of the civilizing mission in building and strengthening hierarchies. Later, in July 2007, newly elected French President Nicolas Sarkozy elaborated a number of racist constructs that revealed the lingering nature of such discourses in post-colonial France, and I quote, "Africa has not yet entered history." The implication, of course, was that the shadow of a paternalist West would be there until the hand-holding was no longer necessary, much like the shadow, as various scholars have pointed out, of the Eiffel Tower built for the 1899 World's Fair as a vertical icon of technological prowess, overlooking here France's ethnological, quote, acquisitions. Having said this, there is some indication that things may be changing. In 2018, French President Emmanuel Macron commissioned a report on the restitution of artifacts and colonial objects in French museums that were pillaged, plundered, stolen, and illicitly exported during the colonial era. Ultimately, this has encouraged former colonial powers to address the past and its legacy. The co-author of the report, Senegalese scholar Felwine Sarr, has repeatedly stated how the question of restitution is an example of complex entanglement and can play a crucial role in proving cultural patrimony for young Africans. If indeed African artifacts inspired contemporary European artists such as Picasso, he asks, why can we not assume the important role they could play in reappropriating history and memory? These developments are also to be framed in a larger context that has been witness to the widespread dissemination and uptake of racialized conspiracy theories such as the Great Replacement, the cornerstone of French extremist and far-right policies. These were also instrumentalized during the Brexit campaign in 2016, when the far-right UK Independence Party, UKIP, published an anti-immigration poster, Breaking Point, "The EU has failed us all," featuring a long queue of migrants. The poster was designed to instill fear by focusing attention on the refugee crisis, inciting racial hatred and migrant phobia, steps that proved effective since immigration was the single most decisive factor for those who voted in favour of leaving the European Union. Since then, the Hungarian government has recycled the same image to similar ends, and in the United States, former President Donald Trump did not hesitate to have recourse to analogous tactics and terminology in order to define immigration as a threat, as terrorism, the travel ban on Muslim-majority countries, as criminality, the, quote, bad hombres from Mexico, and undesirability, people originating from so-called shithole countries. There is considerable evidence that points to the multiple ways in which stereotypes, ethnological references, and lasting benign colonial myths continue to shape contemporary debates on multiculturalism and immigration, while also highlighting how individuals and groups continue to harbour forms of nostalgia relating to the colonial era or a previous national identity. Most notably in Germany, Thilo Saracen, in his 2010 book, Germany Abolishes Itself, or in campaigns such as the Alternative for Germany's 2017 campaign, New Germans, we don't need them, we can make our own. The first quarter of the 21st century has seen a resurgence of debates focusing on slavery and colonialism and their respective postcolonial legacies. These are found in debates on restitution, reparation, historical accountability and responsibility, memory wars, revisionist agendas, and in identity politics. These have been most evident and striking in the public space, with the toppling, spray painting, or beheading of statues that have glorified or honoured racist figures, signs and symbols of a painful history. These actions are not new, but their numbers have grown internationally. Positions have become increasingly polarized and entrenched, juxtaposing forms of activism with those who bemoan the loss of a glorious past. In the 2022 French presidential elections, now 60 years since the majority of the French Empire achieved independence, every single major candidate made statements about colonial history in a fierce process of one-upmanship, a memory war that underscores the proverbial pass that will never pass. In turn, artists and writers have endeavoured to provide a counterpoint in the face of an intensification of the dehumanization of migrants and the debasing logic and political rhetoric and recourse to official statistics, measures that make it easier to deport and expel and to dissociate such measures from any reference to the migrant's own experience. Chinese artist, dissident and activist Ai Weiwei has produced a number of important works on the global migrant crisis, questioning what happens when those from over there come here. Among his most powerful work was a major installation at the Prague National Gallery in 2017-18, The Law of the Journey. The installation, reminding us of real-life watercrafts, established a link between the evidentiary mode as exemplified by Mediterranean patrols and rescues and the artistic representation in the guise of a 40-meter, 131-feet-long inflatable black PVC rubber dinghy watercraft suspended from the ceiling and overcrowded with 302 indistinguishable black plasticized human figures. The choice of materials, the stitching and rubber together, served to reinforce the sense of fragility, the imminent tearing of the fabric. Viewers are struck by the indistinguishability and interchangeability of the figures in the zodiac, by their replaceability and substitutionability, their infinite demultiplication, their anonymity and loss of individuality, swollen bodies clad in life jackets, always already hinting at a pending drowning, swollen pre-carcasses, a premonition of a death to come, poised to be engulfed, sucked underwater, in an ocean eager to further swell the bodies, pre-wretches of the Mediterranean, in a transhistorical dialogue with Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, bodies that will eventually be washed up on the shores of Europe, a fortress that long ago lifted the drawbridge, determined to combat rather than solve the crisis. Passengers cling to the sides as they cling to what little hope they have of surviving. A raft afloat, precariously suspended, the signs throughout the exhibit warning visitors not to walk under the installation lest it should collapse, hands reaching out, extended to onlookers, hoping someone will grab them and steer them to safety. Questions of travel, imaginative and figurative, were central to the production and visualization of the French Empire. The noun France traveled, but also the adjective French, since the systematic expansion of territorial borders was accompanied by efforts to establish French cultural prototypes as intrinsic components of a civilizing mission deployed in an ambitious global framework. Today, heated debates pertaining to border control and sovereignty can be traced back to this era, and people all too often forget that mainland France is only one component of a far more expansive territorial configuration that includes departments, regions, collectivities, and lands in the Caribbean, the Americas, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and Antarctica. During French colonialism, attention to such matters was crucial in disseminating and encouraging identification with the notion of French grandeur, and France overseas was a source of tremendous pride that has remained etched in contemporary imaginaries. The study of propaganda is thus all the more fascinating in this regard, most notably because what we can learn from the interplay between word and image. Iconographic materials provide unique insights into the colonial past and accordingly help us to better understand how generations of colonizing and colonized subjects were conditioned by these imageries and how they continue to impact society today. The images I will discuss draw upon recent research published in 2 books I co-edited and wrote in 2021 and 2022. Visualizing Empire, Africa, Europe, and the Politics of Representation with Rebecca Peabody from the Getty and Stephen Nelson, who's a former faculty member at UCLA, now works at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and the book that is circulating, Colonisation et Propagande, that just came out in March, Le Pouvoir de l'Image, with historians Sandrine Lemaire, Pascal Blanchard, and Nicolas Bancel, and the Franco-Congolese novelist Alain Mabankou. A study of how propaganda operated in France during the colonial era can improve our understanding of colonial history and of its various legacies. The French colonial imaginary generated, for over a century, a steady flow of iconographic material, quantitatively greater than any other imperial power. This visual culture was simultaneously fascinating, repulsive, nationalistic, patriotic, imperial, exotic, erotic, economic, and racialized in nature. From the early days of the Third Republic to the immediate aftermath of political independence, from 1870 to 1970, successive generations were submerged in a colonial bath. Each image participated in the elaboration of a social imaginary through which the national community constructed itself. The objective was to encourage each French person to join in the imperial enterprise, to enlist and mobilize support for expansion overseas. The idea of a greater France and of the civilizing mission spanned several generations and together yielded what has become known as a colonial culture. Speaking before the Chamber of Deputies in 1885, Jules Ferry, French statesman, declared, "I repeat that the superior races have a right because they have a duty. They have a duty to civilize the inferior races." In the mid-19th century, when very few Europeans traveled overseas, an average person with a shilling or a franc and a spare day could step into the cultures of other continents in their nation's empire, in London at the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851, or in Paris at the Exposition Universelle in 1855, where they could find exhibits and other materials that glorified and promoted the benefits of empire. By the end of World War I, France had entered what French historian Jean Suré-Canal has called the golden age of colonialism. Having fortified their colonial holdings in the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, the Indian Ocean, and Asia, the French could rightly claim to have expanded their dominion to the four corners of the earth. This point was celebrated in 1931, when 33 million people acquired entry tickets to the Paris's Exposition Coloniale Internationale. On that occasion, imperialism was not a sub-theme, but rather the explicit purpose. Visitors could, as the government slogan advertised, take a tour of the world in a day, touching down on continents and oceans that represented the breadth of France overseas, as you see in the surrounding caption. A close examination and decoding of these imaginaries becomes essential in order to understand the historical matrix and how it was instrumentalized to legitimize colonialism. This visual culture was the foundation upon which Republican thought was initially built, long before the emergence of contemporary debates on colonial legacies. The first half of the 19th century was especially rich in visual materials, and the exploits of colonial heroes were already capturing public interest in magazines. Passion for overseas exploration to distant lands was very real, and learned geography societies started organizing conferences on travel. Adventure novels presented intrepid explorers facing all kinds of dangers, encounters with exotic and savage populations, and gradually delineated the tour of the white hero figure as the bearer of civilization started to emerge, thereby paving the way and justification for future conquests. Throughout the 19th century, France manufactured representations of an Orient populated by fierce Arabs, of an impenetrable, mysterious and savage Africa, of an unsettling Asia, and of an Oceania defined by heavenly depictions. It would not take long for an exotic iconography to emerge in the guise of postcards, stamps, arts and crafts, or in the figure of Marianne, the national personification of the French Republic since the French Revolution, and benefactress through which the connection between conquest and civilization was firmly established. These provided the foundations of an iconography of colonial propaganda in the last part of the 19th century, one bolstered by codes, images, and messages that were widely deployed and disseminated at the service of economic interests, and that became institutionalized with the new motto, watchwords, and slogans of the colonial party, and its commitment to a civilizing mission, eager to sell the idea of colonies and transform public opinion. Images portrayed colonization as the materialization, major accomplishment and historic achievement of an intrinsically glorious France, building patriotism and national pride, while also establishing a fusional relationship between metropolitan and overseas territories. The myth of a greater France finds itself embodied in the images themselves. These images were seen by millions of people and became components of everyday life. The scale of production and extent of visibility was the outcome of extraordinarily high print runs that ran in the millions in the late 19th century of postcards depicting colonial themes and thousands of colonial posters. The 1931 exhibition was organized around the Lac Dominic that stood at the center of the Bois de Vincennes on the eastern outskirts of Paris. Visitors were treated to a choreographed display, to what Robert Rydell has described as a stunning imperial fantasy land, complete with transplanted vegetation and indigenous people on display in so-called native villages. A stimulating environment, what Christopher Miller discusses in terms of a state-sponsored hallucination, or, as Caroline Jones has aptly claimed, a sensorium, awakening an appetite for the sights, sounds, tastes, and smells of French visitors. The design of the numerous maps produced to guide visitors emphasized the idea of taking a tour and accordingly helped shape their adventure around the world, predominantly to expose them to the awe-inspiring Greater France and civilizing mission. The spectacular array of architecture included the 5,000 square meters, 54,000 square foot, 55-meter high, 180-foot high replica of the Cambodian temple of Angkor Wat that were juxtaposed with an educational dimension that made it possible to establish connections between peoples, products, and territorial spaces. In our book, Colonisation et Propagande, we paid careful attention to providing the necessary tools for the contextualization of the selected images, emphasizing that they are all coded, structured on a racial apparatus. Detailed descriptions and explanations accompany these images in the text and were guided by the following framework. What was the historical context and belief system at the time? What were the various codes and signifiers? What was their objective and why might they be considered harmful or objectionable today? And of course, the key fundamental question, should these images be shown again? The 1931 Exposition Colonial then marked a turning point in the visual messaging. The two main posters I will briefly discuss were edited in the tens of thousands. They feature a distinctly modern and carefully planned conception of colonial propaganda. A year before the official opening of the exhibition, a large-scale media campaign was launched in which all the newspapers featured stories tracking how the preparations and work were advancing, thereby holding the public spellbound. The building site was massive, covering hundreds of acres. The metro line had to be extended so that visitors could access the exhibition site. The new Museum of the Colonies, the temples, the mosques, and a zoological garden were built, and the logistics put in place that would enable 250,000 daily visitors. The colonies in France came face to face, as evidenced in these posters. The separation between the two, between the colonizers and the colonized, is striking. On the one hand, one finds the indigenous populations, symbols of this tour of the world, in one day you see extolled in the caption. These posters serve as a tricolour allegory with the red, white and blue of the French national flag, Republic, and its ideals, while the flag is flown in the background at full mast, reaffirming the legitimate rights of the proprietor. The images bring together the various races, brown for North Africa, the yellow for Indochina, the black for Sub-Saharan Africa, and not forgetting the connection to the past, an invocation to the American colonies via the Red Indians. Looking out to the horizon, the white onlooker, the only race not actually included in the image, serves to reinforce the hierarchical colonial gaze and reminds onlookers that these populations are different to the French. Arguably, the most representative poster was Éric Castel's 1942, 3 colours, 1 flag, 1 empire. The slogan proved to be very effective, and the fate of France and its colonial populations inextricably intertwined. The number 3 is key to the composition. At the bottom, a short text containing the imperial slogan and spread over 3 lines. In the centre, 3 individuals symbolising the most important populations in the empire. And in the top section, the French flag, symbol of the guardian nation. Even the typography is revealing, and the largest font is reserved for the word empire. Similarly, the 3 colours find an echo in the 3 populations. Nothing is open to misinterpretation. The Arab, Black man, and Asian are all readily identifiable based on widely disseminated and recognizable stereotypes. As with the previous poster, they share a certain commonality in their shared difference, yet simultaneously as stakeholders in the destiny of France, a France that is strong thanks to the mobilization of its colors. The First World War underlined the carnal link between metropolitan France and its colonies. With banania, the powdered drink made from cocoa, banana flour, cereals, honey, and sugar, and marketed from 1914 onwards, the ultimate symbol of the Senegalese infantryman was fused with colonial products. 2 nutrients fortifying France and capable of leading it to victory, whereby the yellow highlighted the product, bananas, and the red, then the blue, the military uniform, symbols of wartime patriotism. Likewise, this 1935 publicity campaign promoting tea emphasizes its gustatory and nutritional quality. The empire has been pacified and is now shown to be working collaboratively to support Greater France. The various fairs became privileged sites for these new products, allowing visitors to attend cooking demonstrations and tastings. Children were deliberately targeted, as with this widely distributed game outlining the production process, beginning in Asia and ending up on the French dinner tables for rice. Official programs and publicity leaflets and handouts distributed by private businesses contributed to the steady information stream, including collector cards and albums produced by chocolate or cigarette companies, samples, souvenirs, ashtrays, stamps, stickers, lighters, you name it. Eventually, the promotion of tourism for the wealthier classes became an important component, as well as recruitment poster campaigns produced in the colonial administration in an attempt to lure young men to enlist in the army or other administrative branches. But they were never enlisted to go to war, only to help build. One of the most striking mechanisms aimed at improving awareness of and bolstering support for the vast French Empire, and these were the board games that were produced. The games themselves were aesthetically pleasing objects and contained a wealth of information about France overseas, bringing these remote places into close proximity. A uniform logic was deployed to represent non-European countries, remoteness, economic opportunity, and adventure. These measures served to establish a particular relationship, one in which France was a great nation because it possessed colonies. The ingredients or defining characteristics and qualities of any respectable board game are to be found here, namely curiosity, passion for adventure, greed, competition, and the message was clear. The French Empire was massive and diverse, and board game designers devoted considerable effort to functionality, to the process of capturing the geographic coverage so that the player's experience would be enhanced, thereby replicating the sense of adventure and discovery that was synonymous with the real-life experience of those who were fortunate enough to venture beyond the shores of the mainland. In the rules of the game, or the Jeu de l'Empire, players are instructed to travel the length and breadth of the French Empire in the shortest possible time, beginning on tile 1 in the southern French port city of Marseille and ending on tile 84 in the northeast French port city of Le Havre. It is a dice game, and progress is of course based on the number rolled. With each tile, the player-traveller is given the assurance that they will enjoy the beauty, attractions, and hazards encountered in the various lands of Imperial France. The imagination will be stimulated, interest piqued, and excitement guaranteed from the sense of perilous adventure. 2 tracks are available, a slower one that contains white and red tiles, the latter delaying, impeding progress or holding players back as they deal with various obstacles, overturned canoes, an iceberg, mechanical problems, or torrential rain, and a fast track with the blue tiles that expedited the journey. With the exception of tile 72 in the bottom middle, devoted to the effigy of Marshal Pétain, all the others contain illustrations featuring the architecture and products associated with France's colonial empire. The 2 other games you will see emphasize the complex transnational and transcolonial networks that define France's great empire and serve to motivate and fuel determination for the expansionist dream, a relentless scramble for resources, while cultivating and nurturing deeper identification with the colonial project and admiration for France's colonial oeuvre and its grandeur. Provide here a couple. You can just see this, and then a couple of German examples will come off, as both a game and then a cigarette collecting game. There are of course numerous counter examples of state-sponsored propaganda, the most obvious being those deployed in the USSR or under Mussolini in Italy, under National Socialism in Germany, or by the United States during the 1930s or during the Cold War. But the Ministry of the Colonies was established in 1895, and the Agence des Colonies became the main institution in France responsible for propaganda in the aftermath of World War I. The agency wielded considerable power and a vast distribution network thanks to representatives for each overseas territory and an unusual capacity to disseminate materials across the media spectrum while also financing various initiatives by providing subventions. The challenge, of course, is to ascertain the impact of these mechanisms on mindsets at the time. What we do know is that at a political level, most people were convinced that national strength resided in the colonial idea. Polling in the late 1930s shows that approximately 90% of people supported the empire, a finding also confirmed by the relatively low impact of anti-colonialism during the interwar period. Propaganda had achieved its goal of propagating the idea of a civilizing mission and French Republican ideals of liberty and fraternity. Efforts continued after the liberation with the era of independence and Algerian War of Independence. In terms of language, the French started to adopt categories such as cooperation, underlying France's fraternal links with the newly independent and overseas territories, all the way up to the neocolonial project of La France-Afrique. The most important thing to remember, unlike the experience of slavery or of segregation, for example, in the United States, is that everything I had described happened overseas, over there, in what has been described as a phantasmagoric world that resulted from the concerted efforts of exhibitions, fairs, colonial films, products, images of deserts, tropical forests. In other words, a collectively shared optical illusion of an elsewhere composed of recurrent projections and representations which would eventually collapse in the face of colonial revolts and the wars of decolonization that paved the way for independence. But these propagandist images obfuscated distant wars, revolts and uprisings while promoting overseas investment interests and establishing and facilitating and enabling commercial interests. Images contributed to a time-space compression, reducing the near and the far and offering an historically unparalleled dream factory. They also made it possible to invisibilize racist practices. And Mauritanian filmmaker Med Ondo has described how, quote, the images of Africa in the media impregnated with racism made it possible to not react and with the means at hand and offer something closer to reality. Europeans persist in clinging to a caricatural, vision of what we are. Colonial history continues to be distorted and instrumentalized, infusing and confusing debates on identity and belonging, and with references to a balance sheet and to revisionist arguments that focus on the infrastructural benefits in the guise of bridges and hospitals, roads, and so on, and embellished with stories about passive populations eager to assist settlers and adventurers. As the philosopher and political scientist Achille Mbembe has so convincingly shown, those we once referred to as blacks were later to appear as people, who, precisely because of their ontological difference, had represented a caricature of the principle of exteriority in opposition to the principle of inclusion. It was therefore extremely difficult to imagine that they were, in fact, just like us, that we could be similar. End quote. We are all the heirs of these images. They are ingrained in culture and collective memory. They shape contemporary mindsets, and we will only be able to move beyond them once we have faced them honestly, confronted them, and analyzed them, so that their unprecedented power of fascination, seduction, and influence will no longer haunt us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful, rich, breathtaking presentation. You've covered so many wonderful, important aspects of colonialism and so many other related themes. There are so many questions to be asked, and I would have many to ask, but I won't. I'll just ask one, and we'll open the floor to questions, and there'll be also questions coming in in my hands virtually from people who watching us. So the question I have, we kind of talked a little bit about it at some point during the workshop, is has to do with the fact that in the U.S. there are, places, even dairy products that we use that have been renamed or taken away from the shelves because they represent, they have a racist component to them. What would you say triggers or makes it possible for these discussions to take place and these initiatives to take place in the US or in other countries?
Thank you, Hakeem. I think there are lots of ways of thinking about that question. I think that the most important aspect of it is education, and is access to materials, and it's understanding how communication takes place. So this is a problem when, for example, in France, colonialism is essentially not taught in the secondary curriculum or inadequately taught. So how do you go about deconstructing images, understanding images, and so on, and also understanding the constant staggering mistakes that advertising agencies make in featuring particular products that rely on racial stereotyping and so on and so forth. So these things have not gone away. So I think that the thing I find the most crucial in all of this, and this is the work that my colleagues in France with Achac, that Pascal Blanchard and his colleagues have been doing for 35 years now, is bringing these materials into greater public visibility so that people can understand what this history was, especially given in the French context where this took place in an overseas context, in a faraway environment that is difficult to understand. And I find it all the more compelling that in this era of divisive and polarized politics, that this last 2022, French election, as I mentioned, the persistent return to discussions around colonialism show that we're a very long way from achieving that goal. Now, there are incredible scholars in France working in these different areas, although having said that, not enough. And so many of them have been forced out of the French institutional context and have gone to the United States or to institutions in Africa or in Asia, because there is a kind of a backlash against deconstructing these images, particularly in the French context, where that whole history of grandeur is inextricably linked to the question of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So therefore, questioning those means questioning that great history of glory and of grandeur. And the second aspect, particularly in the French context, is this incapacity to talk about race. The way in which they continue to proceed with the sort of discussions around a colorblind republic. And I think once again, I come back to a statement that Achille Mbembe made and then open up the questions, is that the indifference to race is in fact an indifference to racism. And that those debates are difficult, they're complicated. We see it in the debates today in Germany around the Humboldt Forum and so on. What do you erase in order to build, and what spaces can you provide people and stakeholders in that particular context and framework?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dominic. Are there any questions? Yes, please.
Can I take up this thing? Thank you very much for your rich exposition of the whole problem going along with racism and race questions in France. I nevertheless learned by my son that they were dealing with questions of colonialism for half a year here in the Lycée Français. So it's not totally true that it's not part of the education at school. But I have a very different question going beyond the time frame you exposed, because I am, as a philosopher, dealing with the philosophical post-structuralism and the question, why did it never refer to the question of colonialism? They started to write from the 60s on, as you know, Michel Foucault, no? Folie et déraison. and he describes a real rupture between reason and madness, and you wonder why he does not reflect on the process of decolonization which goes on in this very moment. He writes his book in 1962. And I mean, the year 60 was the year of the decolonization of Africa, no? And when he describes this kind of rupture between reason and madness, he could very well have developed on all the question of where to attribute reason and stuff and so forth, no? Mm-hmm. And I continue with this question up to Deleuze and others, who all of them are not aware, obviously, that the whole country is undergoing a restructuralism, or how would you say that? A change, no, a profound change, while being occupied or preoccupied by questions of structures and énoncés, machin, etc. And I have no response to this question until now.
Right.
Probably you
can't. But it's right. Well, the best questions are the ones we can't really answer, but we can debate, right? I mean, I think that, so a couple of things. First of all, there are clear blind spots. Philosophers are philosophizing often about things that concern them. It might reinforce the argument that what happened overseas was less of a sort of concern. What's interesting is the way in which Foucault's work and the various theorists that you've mentioned have proven to be foundational to precisely the question of the colonial conversation, right? Because of power and hierarchies and asymmetries and so on and so forth. What I would say, to play devil's advocate, is I don't care about what Foucault was saying, because at the very same time in history, Frantz Fanon was writing, along with many, many, many other important theorists from Aimé Césaire and others, and then the legacy of that, Édouard Glissant, Chamoiseau, and the list just keeps going on. What's fascinating about that, though, and that just quickly, very briefly, rejoins some of the contemporary debates and issues today, is that so many of those thinkers did not find institutional, although published in France, but did not find institutional recognition, posts, jobs, etc., and they ended up being appropriated, you could argue, by the field of postcolonial studies, primarily in the Anglophone world. And it's when these writers are then translated from the French into English that these massive audiences develop in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, the UK, and so on. And today the polemic in France is to dismiss thinking around gender, postcolonialism, and to dismiss them as Islamo-leftists that are eager to destroy the invisibility of the Republic. And the French will argue, certain French, will argue, that these theories are being imported, like McDonald's in a way. So, McDonald's is horrible, so what comes from America must be horrible. But in fact, it's a re-importation of products that are made by French and Francophone thinkers that are re-entering into the academy and destabilizing them. And the problem is, and I have no problem with Foucault, but problem with so many of the senior researchers and faculty in France, is that they completely ignored the question of gender studies and of postcolonial studies and of race studies and so on and so forth. And rather than retool, rather than read, rather than learn, they prefer to denigrate it and to block institutional posts and openings for young scholars who then find themselves forced out into other spheres, which is why the conversation sometimes in France is a sort of constant, circular, which seems to never really genuinely move away from those particular structures. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't incredible synergies between some of these thinkers, but I would agree with you that the colonial question was underexplored by these theorists and by these thinkers at these particular moments. Although Roland Barthes wrote an interesting essay on, la grammaire africaine, and there are others that are there. They can't completely be ignored. But what they also ignored to a great extent was the gender question as well. So it's not just the question of race and of society. And then I'm very happy to hear that that the lycée here is putting the colonial question forward. It's going to be an interesting thing because, as you know, the new French Minister of Education, Pape Ndiaye, having just given up the position of directing the Museum of Immigration, himself an eminent scholar of race in the United States, it's going to be interesting to see whether he has the ability to enact certain transformations at the secondary level in schools in France by changing the curriculum and reintroducing some writers that used to be on the syllabus but that have been gradually over time eliminated. And of course, that representation is also evident in the parliament, where there's a gross underrepresentation of minority communities in France today as well.
Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. I wondered if you could say a bit about what sort of limits you would acknowledge for the process of deconstructing the image, because obviously imperialism isn't over. It's taken many new forms, and it's obviously accompanied today by an incredible sophistication in the capacity to analyze propaganda and forms of racism and so on. So I wonder what sort of...
It's a great question. Let me just tell you one thing. This is funny because in talking about the book to different people, it's like French colonial posters are often beautiful. People put them on their walls. They don't put National Socialist posters up. You know, it's like the Mussolini posters. There's the beauty and there's an aesthetic that's there as well, which I think makes that debate very complicated. In 2018, the same group of us that were involved in this book as the coordinators, but then with 96, I think it was, researchers from around the world, Sex, Race et Colonie. It's a 10-kilo book with, I think, 1,000 images in it. What we didn't do enough of in that book was analyze the images. So they're just sort of freestanding images and representations of people and so on and so forth, right? And this triggered a very substantial public debate that also coincided with new growing awareness of racial hierarchies, systemic racism, structural racism, social justice, all of these kinds of debates. So we had a limitation in terms of the amount of attention that we were devoting to just providing evidentiary sort of materials. And that then triggered a debate about should you show them or not. Now, in the United States, in the South, in Mississippi, or is it Alabama, a new museum has opened with spectacular representations of lynchings and so on and so forth, right? Very controversial, but providing that sort of evidence of this history as a way of educating people as to the harmfulness, the offensiveness of it, and so on and so forth. And so there's an ongoing public debate about whether to show or not to show. I think that one of the big problems with the French colonial context is that there's just a lack of availability of these images, and so bringing them out into the public space through exhibitions, which is a lot of the work that the Ashak Research Group is doing today, and bringing the images out into books allows not just us, but others to use these raw materials and to be able to work on them. And let me just give you a paradox of that. So I work in Los Angeles. The Getty Museum, or the Getty Foundation there, specializes in Europe. But because it specializes in Europe, it can acquire French colonial historical materials. And so the work that we did for the Visual Cultures book in 2021 was done in LA using boxes and boxes and boxes of French colonial archives, okay? So if you're in France, you don't have access to those unless you travel there, unless you go there. So the general sort of availability of these materials, the ability to just even look at them beyond being able even to comment on them, as we want to initially bring them out into the space, but we want other people to be able to comment on them, to share their perspectives, their historical experiences and takes, and also to look at them in a comparative context. Because as with this colonial history, everything I just said there, or the discussion of exhibitions, human zoos, could have been done in Korea, in Japan, and in other areas around the world. These are global phenomena, you know. So we're looking at it through a particular focus, trying to bring in interdisciplinary groups, like a novelist, like Alain Mabancou, co-writes the book. Some are historians, some have more of a literary background, and trying to get the greatest sort of multi-disciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches to be able to unpack the significance and to better understand the past and how it continues to impact society today. And I think that's where it connects with debates on statues. Should you tear them down? Should you not? Should you put them in a museum or should you add plaques to them, right? And there's no one single answer. But there's a public debate about it, and so long as the debate continues to take place, you know, I think that's a positive step.
Let me read you a question that we just received. Is there a comparable process of examining propaganda underway in countries that had been part of the Soviet or Yugoslav empires?
So thank you to the Zoom audience for that question. The answer is unambiguously yes, and I think actually, propaganda is back because it's one of the coincidences of this work. We see it. Well, first of all, I didn't talk more about it, but the whole question of post-truth, post-fact, etc. Right? The Trump era, of course, exacerbated that. Social media has changed that, but obviously the conflict unfolding in Ukraine today. The incredible reliance and effectiveness of Russian propaganda today means that many people have a completely distorted view of the world and of reality. And I would argue that in the case of fake news and so on, the same kind of mechanisms are at work in the United States today. And they're proving incredibly powerful because they're increasingly polarizing. They actually make conversations in the public square increasingly difficult, and to that extent it's a victory because we precisely want to be able to have heated debates and discussions, but not so polarizing that they lead to conflict and so on too. So that's a great question, and I think it's a really important field of study. And in fact, many of our doctoral students today are interested in not just propaganda, but in revisiting works in which there is an interplay between text and image, whether it's in film, whether it's in cartoons, bande dessinée, graphic novels, and so on, to see how that interplay works. And I think that the study of propaganda is very crucial in understanding how those mechanisms work and how to understand society today, and social media, and advertising, and the world that you're being sold through these very powerful campaigns that are launched by companies like Apple and so on and so forth, and we need to be aware, I think, about as to how those mechanisms operate so that we are genuinely free citizens with agency, so that when we make decisions, they are genuinely conscious decisions and not manufactured, as Chomsky would say, by a social system of conditioning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very insightful lecture. When it comes to the representation of different races, at least in the cases, in the examples that you have shown us, one cannot see the hate towards these races.
I think it might be. I'm sorry, but I'm really having trouble up here.
Can you understand me better now?
Yes.
So, in the representation of these different races, right, you cannot see hate. You cannot see. Well, what I wanted to ask is, from the perspective of the contemporaries back then, were these representations seen or understood as emancipatory,
as what? Sorry.
Emancipatory.
Right.
Yeah. Or were they reinforcing the racist view? I will give you a little example from Central Europe and from Germany. In caricatural representation of Jews, the stereotypes that are reinforced are always full of hatred, right? And here, at least in these examples that you have shown, you don't see these stereotypes that are full of hatred and full of exemplifying that this is a lower race, right? That these are subhumans. So, can you maybe comment on that from the perspective of the contemporaries?
Right.
Thank you so much.
As we look back at them, you mean?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So, a couple of things. So, first of all, as with anything, a book, a curated show, a talk, I curated what I showed and what I didn't show. There are many very disturbing and stereotypical images available across the work, including in cartoon books. If you go back and read Tintin, et cetera, they're there. Horrendously violent, images of soldiers with the heads of Africans on their guns and so on and so forth. So there's a very, very disturbing history, and the history of display and human zoos and the horrendous conditions are all sort of there. I agree with you that in those posters, for me, it's less the representations are stereotypical because the African continent is reduced essentially to, let's just say, two spaces one separated by the Sahara and one below the Sahara, in which the representations are then standardized with no taking into account of differences across different groups, areas, and so on and so forth. It's the ease with which the continent is artificially carved up into these new borders and boundaries at the Berlin Conference. So they're not automatically, I think, offensive in the terms of a sort of cartoon-like or caricature of those images, but I think they're offensive in the way in which they erase cultural specificity and reductionist, and in a sort of reductionist way that ignores localities and languages and so on and so forth. And that then, through the contemporary eye, feeds into, I mean, you've got to have some you-know-whats to go to Senegal in 2007 and for Sarkozy, I mean, to deliver that speech, right? And it's the question of the speechwriters around him producing that, and then him accepting to actually read that, and the way in which that then infuses his entire policy of selected immigration and so on and so forth, which is really not that different than what Trump ends up with those various sort of categorizations and so on that they go into that too. So I think it's that sort of reduction to the other as being a bad hombres, as being from a particular country like Trump, that ends up being vehicled or contained in those sort of broad sets of images. But you should not come away from this presentation believing that they are all aesthetically pleasing or aesthetically crafted. There are highly disturbing sort of images. And I think that in this book, Colonialism and Propaganda, we worked more on the sort of the communication, the creating of a colonial culture, the enlisting and mobilizing of people, whereas in Sex, Race et Colonie, it's about colonial violence and throughout empire. The Libération wrote an article of sort of summarizing the book as sort of, 450 years of a sort of colonial sexual safari, of going abroad, enlisting people to go to Oceania was about the exoticism of the space and the sort of the potential for sexual liberation in those colonial environments at a time when post-Enlightenment Europe was restricting gender roles, sexuality, controlling women, and so on and so forth. And I think it's interesting because the end of that book also analyzes racialized categories on social media, in pornography, and today, and you see the survival of an incredible amount of stereotyping in those different ways of disseminating forms of sexual identity and constructs and so on.
You described how you use the collection of colonial material in a museum in Los Angeles, which would probably not be available in France for research. And I think that in the discussion sometimes it would be important to emphasize that exhibits or material should be available and accessible. Which is now, with globalization and with seeing things online, much easier than before. Of course, many exhibits have been stolen, robbed, taken under pressure, and restitution is an important topic. On the other hand, if things are available and accessible and fragile and are well preserved, and would it not also be a good idea to support countries where they are coming from to, first of all, have museums that can do the same for the preservation of exhibits and things, than to restitute them quickly and then risk that they will not be preserved or available?
I mean, thank you for really your comments and sort of the question too. I mean, I agree with you that the several things you listed there are really important conversations that many people are having. And there's no one single or even maybe easy way of going about answering them. I think that when it comes to talking about availability through digital technologies and so on and so forth, that's a positive development, but it still implies access And there's also a radical difference between the physical presence of those objects in a cultural context and the life that they have and remote access through digitization and so on and so forth. So there's a huge debate to be had there. You also talk about there have been incredible initiatives both generated within, let's just say, the African continent, because this isn't just about Africa, it's about many other areas of the world, in which new museographical spaces are being developed that allow for preservation and so on and so forth. So those initiatives are afloat. I think that the question, like Felwine Sarr talks about, is that the lack of access for the African youth that he's very concerned about to these materials is a major problem. So if you have European children going to museums where they're able to look at their heritage in the Louvre and big museums here and so on, there seems to be an inequity there too. But I think there's another aspect that certainly I'm interested in when it comes to sort of the idea of preservation, which is linked to commodification as well, is that so many of these objects that have been commodified in Western ethnographic museums, as they're often referred to, were never designed to be in those particular spaces. They are ceremonial objects that had particular roles to play in cultural contexts, and those people were denied the capacity to use those and to decide of where their futures would be. And I think that also in the whole debate around restitution, there are tremendous inequities in terms of who gets to ask, the various rules and regulations about what can be given back, what the origin is, and so on and so forth. So I think it's an ongoing process. I find that the work that Bénédicte Savoy and Felwine Sarr did a really kind of positive development. But I think we're a long, long way from having resolved these issues, and we need to have conversations about this, and conversations, as every museum will say, that involve what we call the global south, to let stakeholders there make decisions about what they think might be good and appropriate for these particular objects. But I agree with you. You raise many really interesting questions, and we need to keep having these kinds of conversations about this. Also, just to say, Quai Branly has over 300,000 objects. There's only a few thousand, on display. Some of these places don't even know what they have. The Quai Branly has the Musée de l'Homme. They have skeletons, they have skulls, they have human remains mixed in and jumbled into these kinds of collections. And so the question of sourcing, provenance is obviously the important term, is also a really important question today. So thank you. Other people at the back, maybe. Yeah, would be.
Yeah, I would like to ask. You mentioned the construction of the other, and there's a part of these constructions is a projection of romantic projections connected with a dreamy world in which you will lose yourself, in which people get lost. I'm talking about literature like that of Joseph Conrad, for instance, colonies in which the European individual disappears and never comes back and never wants to come back as well. I would like to know how you would comment on this, on these fantasies. You mentioned the erotic fantasies, but those I'm talking about are not necessarily erotic. It's more romantic. Mm-hmm. And I would like to know if you would consider them as racist as well.
It's a great question. It's not just whether do I, but writers, thinkers, such as Chinua Achebe, does find them, to be. It's not just me. I'm a reader. I study it. I'm a scholar. I share it. That's it too. It's ask those who are represented. Ask those who have been stigmatized. Ask those who are suffering. The legacies of colonial rule and so on and so forth. So that, to me, the sort of the romantic aspect is linked to this myth making, fantasy. Of finding something else that is constructed through a range of mechanisms, education, choice, images, and so on and so forth. What I find, and so the answer is unambiguously, absolutely yes, they are. But what's interesting is today, the question from the gentleman at the back, today we have a certain view on them. 50 years ago, people had a different way of looking at them. 25 years ago, so we're constantly moving and finding new ways of reading text, right? If you study, 18th, 19th century, British literature, at one time it was about maybe, marriage and family dynamics. Then people started to read it through a postcolonial lens. Now we're reading it through an environmental lens, and so on and so forth. So there are different ways in which these readings take place. What I find interesting with this is that the persistence and the survival of these discourses in characterizations of migrants, refugees, immigrants, and so on, and the persistent power of these discourses in contemporary conversations in just take one place, Europe, around questions of kind of racial stereotyping and so on and so forth. So there's been like really interesting work by filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, sociologists, and so on and so forth, interviewing both minority subjects and white subjects and so on and so forth about how they see the other, how they see themselves, how they go about thinking about what might constitute racism, identity, social media identities, and so on and so forth. And so there are interesting ways. The former French World Cup winning footballer Lilian Thuram was a curator, along with Pascal Blanchard, of that incredible exhibit in 2011-12 at the Quai Branly in France that was called called About Human Zoos. One of the most visited exhibitions, and by thousands and thousands of school children, and just many, many people who, in confronting these imaginaries, these sort of romanticized images, stated that I never knew. Like, I had no idea where this came from, how this happened, and so on and so forth. So all of these are linked to these different kinds of layers. It's also interesting for those who work on, say, contemporary travel writing to understand how those discourses that were available 50 years ago, actually you can study like travel brochures from 50 years ago and remap them onto contemporary brochures that are selling similar kinds of romanticized visions. And there's one book which, if you haven't read it, do read it. It's, I think, out in German too, by Guillaume Blanc, a French researcher, and it's called Le Colonialisme Vert, Green Colonialism, and it's about the creation of parks, nature parks and preserves on the African continent at the moment of political independence, and the way in which populations are evacuated in order to create an Eden, a myth, and a romanticized myth of what the African continent was like and could be like. And it's filled with all the colonial administrators who lost their jobs, and so they went back with a new form of technocratic expertise and sold it to African leaders to provide them with opportunities for income generation through tourism to these kinds of parks. And the guidebooks sell it. It's like reading Conrad. It's like reading, other writers of that kind of area. The myth-making and the romanticization is still there, and it's powerful, and it convinces people as they try to escape new forms of modernity in contemporary society, to escape to those romanticized Edens, Can
you name the author again, please?
Yes, Guillaume Blanc, B-L-A-N-C. And I think it's, I had the German title the other day, but those of you who will be able to know, it's exactly the same. So it's Colonialismus, but what would it be? Grüne? Right, there you go, yes. So I know it's coming out in English like any time now, and it's a really accessible book, and it goes really heavily after organizations like UNESCO, World Wildlife Fund, and so on and so forth, and looks at the sort of the inextricable link between these often not even governmental organizations and sort of that legacy of colonialism. But it's exactly what you say. It's selling a romantic myth to people at different moments in history. We have a cocktail reception, don't we? The last question then, from that gentleman, yeah.
This is going to be the last question.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your great presentation and your extensive work on the subject. I'd like to know, maybe also as a closing question, from all your findings on the issue of colonial propaganda, what would you say, apart from just not acting racist, what would be the most important findings for European or Western governments and non-governmental actors in order to establish partnerships with African countries. Because we already seen that people are questioning, will African countries even be able to store all these beautiful artifacts? There's a lot of prejudice also in dealing, even talking about Africa as a whole instead of talking about different countries, who some are already on the democratic standard as Italy or Europe, others are still authoritarian regimes. So what would you say are those findings from looking at the propaganda? What is important for the future also?
Yes, so first of all, propaganda is different than, say, what's being held in museum holdings and so on and so forth, right? We're talking about different sort of sourcing and so on and so forth. So what's really interesting about doing this book is that this was not like this is not an edited volume. 5 of us wrote it, so it's 10 hands, 5 heads with very different views on it too. So and very different trainings. So Sandrine Lemaire, who's an incredible French historian, she wrote her doctoral dissertation on the Agence des Colonies, and at a time when we didn't have iPhones and so on and so forth. So she's down at Aix-en-Provence at this decentralized French colonial archives, 1,100 cardboard boxes. Receipts, maps, discussions. She went through it all. So she brings sort of for her, for me, it's like the incredibly overwhelming mass of it all to just go through the archival government holdings. Remember, the French had a ministry of the colonies, right? So all of that, and it gets broken down into different ministries eventually, overseas, the Ministry of Culture, which André Malraux ran, and so on and so forth. So it's very complicated. There's just a mass of stuff. Finding all the materials, like gathering the maps, the games, and so on and so forth, that's a labor of love that historians like Blanchard and Éric Deroux and Nicolas Bancel spent 35 years gathering almost like as a hobby. It's like, obviously, you go around in Berlin to these different markets and so on and so forth. They're filled with GDR, relics, and so on and so forth. And there are collectors. And maybe in 50 years, they'll have that kind of incredible daily culture of say, GDR objects. And there's some colonial materials in Germany, but nothing like there used to be 30 years ago in France, but now you cannot find it anymore. So the mass of it. When it comes to your other point, you're absolutely right. This indistinguishability of the African continent as one particular space ignores 2 things: the vast diversity between countries, and also, I think, the incredible role that the global African diaspora plays today. And we're talking about African diaspora in China, in the United States, in Canada, in Central and South America, and so on and so forth. And I think those conversations are really interesting at every level. We saw the background to it, for example, discussions around feminism, the question of Africa and universal feminism and so on and so forth, and then feminist movements generated in the West versus the continent. So it's that dialogue once again that's really important. And as always with these conversations, is to make sure that the conversations take place in a highly conscious environment of representation, where stakeholders from all different sort of walks of life and society, are involved in determining the best way to kind of access this information, these materials. And remember that also in the French context, some of these archives are especially problematic, especially around my colleagues that work on Algeria. There's a lot of the Algeria stuff is shut down in France. You can't see it, you can't access it. So the politics of this all is really kind of complicated as well. And they don't like people digging into these archives because what you find is often a bad story, And that's the challenge for researchers. And like I said, especially around Algeria, in the French context there too. So yeah, it's a great points.
My apologies to the viewers who asked questions and which we don't have the time to, which I don't have the time to read to you, Dominic, but I'm sure they can be forwarded to you. Please join me in thanking Professor Dominic Thomas for not only a stellar talk, but also amazing answers to our questions today. Thank you to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much.